In today's lesson on the Cold War era, we're going to be actually focusing on the civil rights movement that takes place during the first half of the Cold War years. The civil rights movement was very important because in our country, it really was after World War II that you had presidents who started looking at this issue again, that it had not truly been strongly considered by any presidents since Abraham Lincoln. So as you set this up in your notebook for today, it goes along with the South Carolina Social Studies Curriculum 5-5.3, and you're going to explain the advancement of the modern civil rights movement. And these are going to be the different topics we're going to learn about: desegregation, armed forces, Brown versus Board of Education, and the roles of Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X, as long as the Civil Rights Acts and the Voting Rights Act. So if you would set this up in your interactive notebook, and I'm going to go ahead and advance in the lesson. So the Civil Rights Movement was defined as a period in history where there was a progression of ideas over time. If you go back in time, you can think about some of the things that happened since then. So let's think 13th Amendment abolished slavery, 14th Amendment recognized former slaves as U.S. citizens, the 15th Amendment gave former slaves the right to vote, and then many Jim Crow laws came into being following Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which promoted the idea of separate but equal. Although the separate portion of it was followed, the equal side was often not followed in terms of the material items. Soldiers were separated by race and fought in segregated units until the end of World War II. So all this has been going on from that time period of following the Civil War up through the end of World War II. So let's take a look at what happens first, and that is military desegregation. And this is something that you're going to want to put into your notes. You're going to want to know about this idea and what happened. I'm going to allow you for these slides to go through and actually really go through and identify what information you feel is important to record in your notes. You can paraphrase and pull out the important details that you feel like were significant in our country's history. So World War II changed the landscape for civil rights in America. The contribution of African Americans to the war effort helped bring about the desegregation of the United States military. They fought in separate units, and just as many of them died for efforts. And Harry Truman actually notices this and brings it into order. And the first branch of the military that gets desegregated is the Army in 1948. He couldn't end the discrimination, but he could end the segregation part. So the military starts to desegregate, and that becomes the first thing to desegregate. It's because of the military desegregation that then organizations like the NAACP start to look at how to desegregate other parts of our society. And one of the ones that gets attention is the integration of public schools, which is a piece that's very important in history and you'll want to include in your notes. But in 1954, the United States Supreme Court declared the practice of school segregation unconstitutional. Basically, that separate was not equal. This comes through a decision called Brown versus Board of Education. According to the Supreme Court, the schools were to be integrated with all deliberate speed. So meaning very quickly that this needed to happen. So now, however, people wanted to question, well, how quick do we have to do this? So over the course of the next 14 years, until the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, the civil rights movement gained momentum. And the integration of schools is what really starts to fuel the whole fact that there are things that are not equal in our country for African Americans in comparison to whites. Now, some people who were important over the years through the movement are shown here: W.E. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Ida B. Wells, Barnett. are all some of those early leaders in the civil rights movement. Some of the ones that we're going to be focusing on today are Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X. So Malcolm X believed that change was not happening quickly enough. He did not believe that white Americans would ever support equal rights for African Americans, and encouraged his followers to rely on themselves as opposed to newly passed civil rights laws. So Malcolm X was very much believed that African Americans needed to work together and that they were going to have to depend upon themselves versus the law to bring about equality. This ends up that because of such efforts, Malcolm X and Dr. King are both assassinated during the last half of the 1960s for their stances on the civil rights movement. They became a public figure to try to bring an end to things of inequality in our country, and that put them as a target. Civil rights leaders used a variety of different strategies to bring attention to the struggle of African Americans to achieve equal rights. So what are some of the things that they did? Well, things that you need to kind of keep in mind is that they had marches, so where they would march and protest. They would do boycotts, which is when they would not do something. For example, one of the things that they did was bus boycotts to work to end segregation on buses, and they just didn't ride the buses. Sit-ins at segregated lunch counters. You have a picture that shows this down here, and then freedom rides, and have a picture here of posters of them on the bus. These activities educated the general public and gained sympathy from many Americans because television brought the abuses of Jim Crow into the living rooms across the country. Because of television, people throughout the country could see what conditions were like, particularly in southern states that promoted segregation. So President John F. Kennedy proposes a civil rights bill to Congress. Following the assassination of him, though, several laws were passed by Congress banning segregation in public places and protecting the right of all Americans to vote during the mid-1960s. So actually, let's think about this for just a second. Several people have been involved in trying to make this happen. Some historians debate, we had mentioned Dr. King and Malcolm X both being assassinated for their involvement in civil rights. There are some historians that argue that Kennedy also was potentially a target for his stance on civil rights. Now, these two acts are very important to us in our country, and the first one is the Civil Rights Act. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination in public places and provided for integration of schools and other public facilities. The Civil Rights Act also made employment discrimination illegal itself. So this is what's going to work to bring about an end to discrimination. The Voting Act is what's designed to prohibit the denial of the right to vote based on literacy tests. Remember, go all the way back when we talked about Reconstruction and how literacy tests were used to keep African Americans, and even were used for whites that could not read, the ability to keep them from voting. But as we talked about then, those tests were only really truly used for African Americans. The Act contains special enforcement policies that focused on those areas of the country where Congress believed the potential for discrimination to be greatest, so where it could happen more often. So for this lesson, I want you to choose an aspect of the modern civil rights movement and explain how it impacted the United States. You can pick desegregation of the military. You could choose to look at the desegregation of schools or other public places. the Voting Rights Act, any part that you want to choose to focus on, and I want you to kind of write about how it impacted the United States.